So welcome everybody, welcome back if you were here last week. If you weren't, you're in for a treat, and welcome everybody online. If I could just ask the people online to make sure that you keep your microphone muted and also your camera off, and there's a reason for that, which is that we're going to be recording this lecture, and if your camera is on while Mark is giving his lecture, in the recording you'll be there and people will be able to see you eating your sandwich or drinking your coffee or whatever it is, which you may or may not mind, but I think it's slightly distracting, so better to have your camera off. But then when and if you ask a question, and we'll have plenty of time, we're very relaxed, there's no reception today, so there's lots of time for questions. I know some people wanted to ask questions last week and weren't able to. We should hopefully be able to get through all the questions today. So without further ado, Mark, over to you.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. This is the second of the Evans-Pritchard, second of four of the 2022 Evans-Pritchard lectures, named in honor of the 20th century British social anthropologist. He was professor of social anthropology here at All Souls College. EP, as he came to be known, Evans-Pritchard EP, was known for his studies of law, religion, politics, mainly in African contexts. And the title of today's lecture is Faith in the Rule of Law. So thank you for those of you who are joining for the first time today. For those of you who are back for the second time, welcome back. And I hope we have a nice discussion afterwards. I hope what happened at the end last time is indicative of the kinds of discussions I hope we can have together about these themes of the kind of the relationship between law, religion, and politics, and the ways, really the ways that international aid actors, that activists, build faith in the rule of law. And when they do this, particularly in non-democratic or authoritarian states, they create more reasons for regimes to build up their legitimacy. So if I could have you hang on to that, that's kind of one of the core themes of today, the ways that activists build faith in the rule of law, which then allows regimes more reasons to build up their own legitimacy and their own legal power. So before I get into today's themes, let me remind you of what we did last week, especially for those of you who weren't able to attend last week, sort of where we are, where we're going. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay, so last Tuesday in my first lecture, I explained the parallels of the rule of law, the parallels between the legal and the theological. And I argued that the rule of law, this idea that no person is above the law, that the law is the sort of the highest power in our societies, this idea of the rule of law, it reads very much like a theology. It reads very much like an Abrahamic theology, as we talked about, especially in the question and answer period in the discussion. The rule of law offers its own systematically developed, its own internally coherent theory of a higher power. It's not a theory of God, it's a theory of law, but it very much relates to the kind of Abrahamic traditions and Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, of a higher power. And indeed, the very form of law, the documents that make up the law, things like constitutions or legal texts, these demand our faith, these demand that we surrender ourselves to their principles, and these demand that we desire them and transmit them across generations. So remember, we talked last time, faith, surrender, and desire, and how these three principles form the psychological foundation both of Abrahamic theologies as well as contemporary legal systems. Faith, surrender, and desire. Let me jump to today's material. And to do that, remember my central argument. My central argument in these lectures is that governments have taken rights from people and activists have tried to take them back. And both of them use law and religion instrumentally in that project. Governments take rights, activists take them back. Both of them try and control legal discourse. Both of them try to control religious discourse, kind of fitting law and religion into their politics, fitting law and religion into their goals. Last time, if you remember at the start, I gave the account of Salma. Salma was a displaced person whom I met in the desert outside of Sudan. Sorry about the noise. That's people joining or leaving Microsoft Teams, and we don't know how to turn it off. I apologize. So please bear with us through that sound. Hopefully they're joining and not leaving. But so if you remember Salma was this young woman I met, and she was displaced by the Civil War. And I wanted to meet her because she had attended one of these legal awareness workshops that were taught in the desert to these people who were displaced by the Civil War to learn about their internationally guaranteed human rights. International aid activists were funding local Sudanese organizations to go to these places to teach people about their rights. And if you remember, Salma told me something that I found very striking, and I think some of you mentioned to me afterwards, you also found it striking. She said, this government has rights, this country has rights, but they never give rights to us. I never get my rights. So the government she saw as the holder of rights, not people, which is the exact opposite of what I was trained to believe as a human rights lawyer. And today's focus is exactly that. It is, how do governments do that? How do governments take rights from people? Next time, I'll just flash forward to next time on May 24th, next week, I'll do the other side of this, which is how activists are sort of taking rights back. But today, I want to focus on, so I'm just swinging back to the slide of May 17th, I want to focus on the way governments use this kind of discursive combination of law and religion, or legal and theological, legal and religious, to take rights, And there are three different styles of governance that I want to talk about in today's lecture. The first is colonialism. The second is dictatorship or authoritarianism. And the third is kind of human rights or humanitarian-based governance. Now, these are very different kinds of people. Colonial administrators, authoritarian regimes, what political scientists would call authoritarian regimes. And I know anthropologists tend to shy away from these terms, but I like to see myself as interdisciplinary, so I'm just going to borrow from the discipline of politics and use the term authoritarian states. States that want to kind of subsume all power under themselves, all political and legal power. And then, of course, humanitarian modes of governance that we are familiar with around democracy or bills of rights, constitutional text, human rights-based governments. These are very, very different kinds of actors. But when I investigated their work, I learned that they have something in common, something striking that they share in common, these colonial, authoritarian, and humanitarian actors. They each demand people's faith in law. They each demand that people submit to law or surrender to law, and they each demand that people desire law, exactly what we talked about last time, faith, surrender, and desire. They each demand that people follow their own law and reject the other system's law. So human rights demands that we reject colonial forms of governance, even though I spoke, and I'll talk in a minute about colonial administrators whom I met and interviewed. They saw themselves as doing human rights work. But human rights demands we reject colonialism and, of course, dictatorship. That goes without saying. Colonialism demands that we reject authoritarianism because it's a threat to the colony, as well as human rights, also a threat. Anti-colonial activism based on human rights would be a threat to colonialism. And dictatorships, authoritarian regimes, of course, differentiate themselves from the previous colonies that existed. The places I studied, and I'll be talking a lot about Sudan today. The dictators in Sudan, Nimeri in the 1970s and 80s, Bashir in the 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, went to great lengths to distance himself from colonialism, but also saw, of course, human rights as a threat, which is why precisely we see human rights activists being imprisoned in places like Russia, in Sudan, in other parts of the world. So each of these forms of governance demands that we reject the other two, demands that we have faith and surrender and desire for that one alone, and that we reject the other two. Something else remarkable is going on. And I just added 3 words to the slide on the bottom of your screen. Something else remarkable is happening. Not only do they demand that we follow their law, but in the process of doing that, they all seem to flatten or sideline religious faith, or specifically in my research, Islam. Colonial administrators and dictators, these two folks, they flatten or sideline Islam by merging a specific view of Islam into the state. And I'll talk about that in my talk, how they do that. They make Islam into a tool of non-democratic governance. Western aid workers or humanitarian modes of governance also sideline and flatten Islam. They see Islam sort of as this one-sided thing that is a tool of dictatorial control and interference with human rights, or maybe something to at least to be avoided, out of fear of offending deeply held beliefs. So my talk, as I said, is based largely on historical and ethnographic evidence from Sudan. And then I'll provide one comparative example from my more recent research in Somalia and Somaliland towards the end of my talk, before sharing the data, let me talk a little bit about my methods. It's something anthropologists don't often do, but I do want to do it because I know there are students here who are engaged in DPhil projects, and I want to share sort of how I did this research. So just give me a couple of minutes to talk about how I did my research. Really three primary methodologies here, and these were similar to the methodologies actually that EP did in his own work. Archival research, qualitative interviews, and ethnographic fieldwork or observations. So I accessed archives. In East Africa, as well as here in the UK, including here in Oxford at the Bodleian. There are some archives on colonial records that are available. And also at Durham University's Palace Green Library. There are a number of great archives there, both on colonial Sudan and the British Somaliland Protectorate. For my research, I also conducted, this is the top of the screen, interviews with lawyers, government officials, religious leaders, elders and chiefs, local civic activists, women's rights activists, and others, foreign aid workers. I'd be happy to talk about the process of doing the interviews, translating and transcribing them, coding them, using a software analysis tool. I can talk about that in the Q&A if you wish. And finally, ethnographic observations. In Sudan, I attended legal awareness workshops, like the workshop I mentioned that Salma had attended. I attended and observed those workshops, these spaces where international groups were encouraging state law to flourish. In the autonomous Somaliland, in kind of the northeastern corner of the Horn of Africa, I also observed workshops by international or local aid groups. These workshops are a place where a lot of collaborations happen, a lot of activities happen around the law. The topics of the workshops and some conferences included things like restorative justice, conflict prevention, state building, secession was another topic of a workshop I attended. So not just legal awareness workshops, but kind of more broadly other topics for the civic sector. So three primary methods, and as I said, very similar to the methods that EP used throughout his career. And these methods, I think, allowed me to triangulate the different ways, or rather the similar ways, that colonial administrators, authoritarian regimes, and human rights activists flatten or sideline Sharia in their work. Okay, so here's our roadmap for the remainder of today's talk. These are the three things I want to do. I want to focus first on colonial administrators and how they use law and religion for their own purposes. Then I want to focus on dictatorships and how they use law and religion for their own purposes. And then finally, I want to focus on international aid agencies and the local non-governmental organizations who they work with, and how they also use law for their purposes, kind of demanding people have faith in a non-religious rule of law. And I'll close with some of the consequences of this parallelism between colonial, authoritarian, and humanitarian uses of law. So colonial, it's the first thing we'll do, then the dictatorships, and then the humanitarian, and then we'll close. So that's kind of the roadmap for where we're headed. Let me begin then with the colonial administrators. And here I want to focus on Sudan. Now, the first major colonial administration in Sudan was not the British. It was not the British. It was Turco-Egyptian occupiers in roughly the middle of the 19th century. The anthropologist Carolyn Fleur-Loben, she's an American anthropologist, she argued that these occupiers did something important with Islam and with Islamic law. They tried to centralize the state's authority by imposing the Hanafi school of Islamic law upon the Sudanese people. for the first time. The Sudanese people were using before that to resolve their disputes a combination of local customs and sort of different forms of Maliki schools of Islamic law before that. And the Turco-Egyptian occupiers came and tried to centralize authority using Islamic law. And this is important because later on, when I talk about the Bashir government, we'll see how the Bashir government tried to do the same thing, centralizing authority using a specific version of Islam. The British rose to power. In 1898, there was an independent sort of Sudanese regime called the Mahdiya in between. But I want to jump, because I'm focused on colonialism, I just want to focus our attention now on the British colonial administration. They gave it the name the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. They gave it the name the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, or Anglo-Egyptian Condominium. It comprises the current boundaries of what is now Sudan and South Sudan. And British officials governed this region until 1956, when Sudan became the first sub-Saharan African country to earn its independence from the British on January 1st, 1956. And British administrators created this whole legal structure for the Sudanese people, a whole entire legal structure. And what's important, what I want you to know about this legal structure is it was not unitary, like what the Turco-Egyptian occupiers tried to do. It was a dualistic legal structure. The British separated Islam from English common law. They created two separate divisions of the colonial judiciary. One was called the civil division, which dealt largely with crimes, and one was called the Shari'a division, which dealt with things like family disputes, inheritance disputes, financial transactions, some property disputes as well, disputes over marriage, divorce, when money was involved. And there were qadis, or judges, who were the judges who sat in the Sharia division. Now you might be wondering, why establish a colonial legal department, and why establish a Sharia division within that legal department? Why not just have one centralized legal system? Even if it were to include Sharia, why not have one centralized legal system? I think the British wanted to reduce the likelihood that Islam would become a rallying point for the Sudanese people. So the colonial administration allowed Islam to exist, but kind of curtailed. There's some noise in the background, I apologize for that. The colonial administration allowed Islam to exist, but they subsumed Islam into the state to control faith, to allow people to continue to have their faith, but prevent them from seeing Islam as a viable alternative to the colonial project. So they wanted to show their legitimacy by having Islam in the government, but they also didn't want to have maybe too much Islam, because then people might see Islam as a viable alternative to the rule of law they were trying to promote. So there, I said it. The British were trying to promote not just law. They weren't trying to promote just sophisticated legal systems. They were trying to build the rule of law, this idea of sort of preventing arbitrary power. So back in the mid-2000s, when I was in Sudan, I returned here to England. I returned because I realized that there was someone who was still alive who had worked for the British colonial administration. His name was Donald Hawley, Sir Donald Hawley. And Hawley studied here in Oxford. He read for a degree in law before joining the colonial administration in Sudan. Many, if not most, of the colonial administrators in what was called the Sudan Political Service. There was the Indian Civil Service. Some of you may be familiar with it if you studied colonialism in South Asia. There was the Sudan Political Service, it was called. Many of them were trained as lawyers here in Oxford, a few in Cambridge, many of them actually here in Oxford, before they joined the SPS, or the Sudan Political Service. And in Sudan, in the 1950s, Donald Hawley was the chief registrar of this judiciary, of the colonial judiciary, before independence. And as the chief registrar, he told me he was tasked with ensuring the independence of the colonial judiciary from the colonial government. Now, this idea of judicial independence, that judges are independent from politics, is one of the hallmarks of the rule of law. It's one of the central ideas of the rule of law, that judges can rule according to the higher power, the law, as opposed to whatever politics might demand of the judges. And so Donald Hawley and I met in his home. He lived in Wiltshire, about 100 kilometers from here. And we met in his home, and I asked him about colonial law, and he mentioned the rule of law. And he shared with me a story that I want to share with you of a Sudanese man who had petitioned his local district commissioner for an increase in grain rations. Okay, so for whatever reason, in that time in Sudan in the early 1950s, donkeys received more grain than rations than adult men. And so this Sudanese man said, what do you imagine he said? He said, I want to legally be considered a donkey so that I can get an increase in grain rations because donkeys receive more grain than men. Maybe not a bad argument, legally speaking. Now, this Sudanese man could have used many other methods to try to correct this injustice of having less grain than a donkey. He could have taken the grain from the donkey. He could have taken up arms against the officials who are distributing the grain. But instead, he chose to petition his local legal representative to change its regulations, to change the law. I mention this story because it illustrates, I think very clearly, how colonial subjects and rulers, the colonial authorities, are in constant dialogue with one another. And the basis for that dialogue, the basis of that dialogue are the ruler's terms, the ruler's laws, the ruler's discourses in the legal spaces that the rulers themselves create to legitimize their authority. So colonialism created spaces for Sudanese people like this man to air their grievances, created spaces, release valves for them to air their grievances so that maybe they didn't take up arms against the government. The British used legal resources, used legal institutions to portray colonialism as moderate, as legitimate, as interested in hearing people's complaints, in ensuring fairness, ensuring justice, ensuring maybe adequate legal standards or living standards for the Sudanese people. More importantly, that a colonized man with a complaint even approached colonial officials to review his petition, suggests that maybe he thought that would work, that going to the law might actually lead to an improvement in his life. So what I want you to see here is that colonialism paradoxically encouraged people to count on the rule of law as an aspect of being colonized. The rule of law became a part of the colony. Now, it was not a complete, perfect, thick, legal scholars like to talk about the difference between thick or thin rule of law. This was not a perfect or thick or ideal rule of law. This was a very thin form of the rule of law, but the point is they tried. The point is colonial administrators tried to implement some kind of rule of law, promoting some kind of faith in the rule of law amongst Sudanese people. And that was, I think, a cornerstone of the British colonial administration. And ending my interview with him, Donald Hawley said, the rule of law was, quote, the basis of our colonial government. The basis of our colonial government. I think another colonial administrator, A.J.V. Arthur, he put it best when he said in his memoirs that the rule of law in colonial Sudan was, quote, the supreme example of benevolent despotism. Now, as I said before, this is not new. This is not new. It's what's happening in Sudan, that colonial regimes would create sophisticated legal systems. The British did it in South Asia. The French did it in West Africa and the Levant. The Italians did it in the Indian Ocean coast in Mogadishu and neighboring areas in what is now Somalia. But my question is why they would promote not just legal systems, but the rule of law. And this question, I think, seems counterintuitive, especially given the many critiques of colonial rule that all of you are familiar with, that Donald Hawley was very familiar with when I interviewed him. And I think the British, one thing they tried to do was they also surrendered themselves to the law. They surrendered themselves to the law. So I accessed colonial records at Durham University, and in the annual reports, you could find these annual reports of the finances and the sort of state of the law of the administration of Sudan. And the British documented colonial officials and others who worked for the colonial administration who sort of went above the law, either taking bribes or selling things taking things they shouldn't have taken, not protecting the environment. And the British documented these things in their annual reports. So they tried to portray an image of fairness and justice, that they themselves were subject to this law as well. It wasn't just the Sudanese who were subject to the law, they themselves were subject to the law. But just as they did this, they were also maintaining an essentially colonial, unjust rule. And colonial administrators are not alone. Dictatorships that emerged in Sudan in the years and decades after after colonial rule, sort of in the post-colony, after 1956. And Sudan has been governed, there have been more years of dictatorship in Sudan, many more years of dictatorship than there have been years of democracy. And these dictatorships, which is why I study them, it's sort of most people have been living under dictatorships in Sudan. And these dictatorships also have tried to portray and promote an image of fairness, an image of justice. And I want to focus our attention right now. I can talk, and I'd be happy to later on, about the many different dictatorships in Sudan, but then I would just be repeating myself because they all kind of did the same thing. So I want to focus on the lengthiest, the wealthiest, maybe the most brutal, and the longest lasting, most notorious of the dictatorships, and that is the 30-year rule of Omar Hassan al-Bashir from 1989 until 2019, until a couple of years ago when the regime fell. So how did this government build its legitimacy? How did it last 30 years? And my answer is they did it just like the colonial administration did it. They tried to build legal power. Bashir also indentured Islam into the state, trying to control the discourse of Islam. So his government built a huge legal infrastructure. They were fighting a war with what is now South Sudan. And that's the one we saw in the media in the 1990s and 2000s, and the peace agreement that was signed in 2005. But my research reveals something else they were doing simultaneously. They were investing a lot of resources to build courts, law schools, the legal profession. And this graph shows that in the early years of the administration, right when the regime came to power, one of the first things they did was they invested in courts. They built courts. This graph that you see on the screen shows a tripling in the number of courts in Sudan in the first half of the Bashir administration, from 250 when Bashir came to power to nearly 750 a couple of decades later. The Sudanese government also tripled the number of law schools in Sudan. They didn't just build all the law schools in the capital city. They built them in different cities to sort of extend their tentacles of power. They became the teachers of law. This graph shows the increase in the legal profession, the growth in the legal profession in Sudan. And you can see this exponential rise in the total number of people registered with the Sudan Bar Association. Bashir comes to power right around here, 1989. And you see this exponential rise in the number of lawyers in Sudan, from 4,000 in 1989 to nearly 16,000, or more than 16,000 in 2005. And I spoke with judicial officials in Sudan about this strategy, the ones who Bashir appointed to be in charge of this strategy. And this was intentional. This was not something like, oh, let's just build courts. This was something they planned. This was something they executed. This is something they decided. It had a name, Taqzir az-Zul al-Qada'i in Arabic, which means shortening of the judicial shadow. Shortening of the judicial shadow. In other words, what they wanted to do was and they literally used this term with me in my interviews with them, bring the courts closer to the people. Create spaces for them to resolve their disputes with one another that were government spaces, so that they wouldn't go to the local elder, the local chief, so that they would go to the government to get their disputes resolved. Why? To build the government's legitimacy, to build stability, to build people's trust in the government. So what you see here is how dictators are building regimes through law, through promoting the rule of law, through promoting courts, legal institutions, building law faculties, building the legal profession, legal personnel. And remember, all of this is happening while Sudan is investing in its military and fighting a civil war against the country that would then become known as South Sudan. Now, of course, dictatorships invest in their militaries. Of course, that is, if you're a dictator, you invest in your military. That's not surprising. But why would someone like Bashir, who would go on to become an indicted war criminal, why would someone like Bashir also invest in the rule of law? I think two things are happening. One is that law serves an important dispute resolution function, helping people resolve their disputes. And the other thing that's happening is that law maintains order. Law maintains order. That is the sort of law and order side of the law. And both of these, this dispute resolution function that law plays in our societies and the order function, the maintaining order and stability function that law plays in our societies, both of these I think are essential to not only our lives here in the UK, but also if you're living in a dictatorship in Sudan. But it wasn't just law that Bashir used to rule. It was a certain kind of law. It was a certain kind of law. Islam ran through the government from the start. So it was a certain kind of law and a certain kind of Islam. Bashir rose to power by proclaiming a national salvation revolution, an Islamic revolution, Inqaz, it was called in Arabic. He had the express goal of Islamizing the Sudanese state, of bringing Islam and Islamic values into the state. Or to quote the words of one Sudanese civic activist whom I met, she said, Bashir wanted to create a, quote, modern, civilized, and Islamic nation. That was his goal when he came to power. So all laws in Sudan, regardless of where they came from, were suddenly became Islamic. So one telling example is the corporate code in Sudan. It was the corporate code from 1925, the British corporate code, that was then imported to Sudan, and then Bashir just translated it into, his government translated it into Arabic, still the same exact code, same words, and they called it Islamic. But it's the 1925 British corporate code. Everything became Islamic, whether or not it actually was, it was for the regime's purposes. The government also importantly added apostasy to Sudan's criminal code. Apostasy is a hudud crime. Hudud in Arabic means borders. It's like the crimes that for which the most extreme punishment is given. Apostasy is leaving Islam. So some of you may be already onto this. Some of you, if you have dictatorial tendencies, you may be onto this. What Bashir is doing is effectively saying, by saying even the corporate code is Islamic. If you agree with anything, even the 1925 corporate code, if you disagree with anything, you are disagreeing with Islam. And disagreeing with Islam is apostasy, which Bashir made a crime punishable by death. A difficult, but also, if you're a dictator, a very neat way of trying to deal with dissent. Now, using religious rhetoric, like Bashir did, using laws and legal resources, they were the lifeblood of the Bashir regime. They are the lifeblood of many dictatorships. But no regime lasts forever. Even the Roman Empire had its end. And Bashir's regime ended in 2019 after 4 months of nonviolent street protests that shut down the capital city, Khartoum. Understanding how regimes end is important. There are a lot of scholars who work on this, scholars in sociology of social movements who care about street protests and social movements in Sudan and in the United States. Black Lives Matter, the Black Civil Rights Movement, Me Too is a social movement. There are many scholars studying this, and there are many scholars studying right now social movements in Sudan. My question is a little bit different. It's not how the regime ended, but it's how did it last so long? How did it last 30 years? How did it last so long? And I think part of the reason it lasted so long is that this focus on building stability and order through the law and through religious rhetoric. Okay, let me summarize where we are so far, and then I'll get to number 3. So let me just summarize what we've done so far. What we've done so far. The first 2 shaded areas in this overview slide. Okay, so I've shown you how the Bashir regime in Sudan, just like the colonial administration before it, how they became the teachers of law, how they controlled legal systems, and how they also tried to control and contain Islam. They built Islamic courts. They used Islamic rhetoric to make religion a part of the state. And here I would sort of step out on a ledge and say the British just like the Turco-Egyptian occupiers I talked about at the very start, really tried to create an Islamic state for the Sudanese people by integrating Islam into the state. The paradox of all this is that they were using the rule of law to promote illegitimate power. They were using the rule of law to promote illegitimate power. Now, in order to turn to the third point, about the ways human rights activists used law, I'm going to step out onto another ledge here, a kind of precarious ledge for someone who is like me, who is trained as an international lawyer, as a human rights lawyer, because I'm going to argue that when aid workers promote faith in the rule of law, their actions promoting faith in the rule of law echo the actions of dictators and colonial administrators who flatten or sideline Islam. Okay, how do they do this? How do they do this? How do they flatten? How is it, if you go into, some of you may be interested in going into human rights work, and how is it? I want people to know, I see young faces in this audience. I want people to know that some of the consequences I found of this work is this flattening or disengagement with or sidelining of Islam. How do they do this? How does this happen? My answer is workshops. Workshops. And the workshops I observed in Sudan were called legal awareness workshops. I mentioned them when I talked about my methods. Remember, I had that graph, the triangulated methods, and the bottom right-hand side was the workshops I attended. And so that's what I want to focus on right now, this ethnography of these workshops. These workshops were conducted in major cities across Sudan. They were conducted in towns. They were conducted in rural areas. So they were in various locations where poor people lived. In some of the places I visited, there was no electricity. There was little to no clean water. People did get bottled water while they were attending the workshops, much like we have in this workshop here, we have a bottle of water in the back. They got individual bottles of water. Now, Sudanese lawyers and activists, often these were women lawyers, they would go into these communities to facilitate these workshops. They would get funding and support from the United Nations. So funding and support would sort of come from the United Nations to these local women's legal aid organizations. And then they would go out to educate displaced persons about their rights under international human rights treaties. And so you might be wondering, in these spaces with very few resources, why are United Nations aid workers, why is sort of global policy investing in teaching people about the law? And more importantly, what are the impacts of doing this? Does it matter? Does it matter? In my interviews with UN officials who were in Sudan, not UN officials elsewhere, I only interviewed UN officials who were in Sudan, who were employed by the UN officials elsewhere. They told me they came to Sudan because of, quote, they use this language, a rule of law vacuum, a rule of law vacuum. There was no rule of law. Now, mind you, remember the first half of this, the whole time I've been talking about the ways colonial administrators and dictators are trying to build the rule of law. But they said there is no rule of law here. There's a vacuum of the rule of law. We need to come and teach people about the rule of law. And so the idea of these workshops is that if people are aware of the law, if they're aware that there are courts out there, if they're aware of international treaties, that they would then go out and assert their rights. If they could just know their rights, they would then go out and assert them, sort of like what Oxford Law Faculty does. If we could train people to understand the law, we would then be good lawyers and do good lawyering in the world. And this is the way sort of the United Nations does it in a place like Sudan. And they have a name for this. It's not Taqzir Azul Akadai, which is the name that Bashir's government gave to it. They call it a rights-based, that was shortening the judicial shadow. They call it a rights-based approach to development. A rights-based approach to development. It's a term of art, and it's all over international law. It's all over like the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. It's the central guiding goal of the United Nations Development Program, which this past year had a budget of $6 billion, 4,000 projects in 150 countries, all guided by this idea of a rights-based approach to development. And the legal awareness workshops are how they make this rights-based approach to development a reality. It's through these workshops. So one could describe the workshops as sort of like a free legal course, free law school for survivors of war. I mean, look at what you see on the screen. It looks almost like a classroom. The format is similar to what we as professors do in our teaching. It's part lecture, part discussion. The facilitator stands up front with a marking pen and a board, and they write things on the board, and they're talking about big topics like democracy or women's rights or the CEDAW Treaty, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, this international treaty. And I mention this so that you can see the kinds of spaces where the international community, the aid community, is hoping to build faith in the rule of law. The next question is, what's the result? What's the result of all this? What's the result of all this? At least in the short term, the workshops did not have their intended benefits of building people's faith that human rights will somehow provide them with their daily needs. It didn't do that. It's not, law is not going to do that. But there were some unintended benefits. There were some unintended benefits that I think were paradoxical. Some of them were really ugly, and I want to talk about them. And I think I want to start with the sort of uglier ones. I think the government got some benefits out of these workshops, small benefits, but I think they're important, and I want to share them with you. I think the government got a few unintended benefits. The workshops provided people with free food and water. I mentioned the free water bottles that they got. The government did not have to provide those water bottles or the food. The workshop provided people with an education for the week, which the government did not have to provide those people with an education. When I spoke with participants about their educational backgrounds, many of them said they cited those workshops, not the state educational system. Here's some photos that I took of a graduation ceremony after a couple of these workshops. The sky, there was a haboob, a dust storm that day, so the sky was a kind of deep yellow color. But you see, and people went out of their way to show me their shahadat, their certificates of completion for these workshops. It was almost like their graduation diploma. This is sort of the graduation ceremonies at the end. The workshops also provided psychosocial support to these people. Imagine, think back to your own graduation days, how it was probably a really good day, or for those who are about to graduate, it probably will be a good, there's a lot of support that you feel, you feel support from the university, you feel support from friends and colleagues, from your teachers. That's what they were feeling that day. The government didn't have to provide that for those people. My point here is that these workshops were designed to create space for people to believe and learn in the law. And this is precisely what the government wanted people to be doing, to believe and learn in the law. Remember, the Bashir regime was actively building courts, actively creating cadres of the legal profession, actively building law schools, creating spaces for people to resolve disputes, which creates the regime's legitimacy, its order, its stability. So the bigger point here, and I'm going to say this slowly because I want you to hold on to this. The bigger point here is that international lawyers sometimes are so focused on the content of the rule of law. They're so focused on the content of the rule of law that they may overlook the paradoxical ways that they are giving regimes more reasons to assert their authority. And one story stands out here. I remember on a visit to one of the IDP camps, I stopped into a tent where a woman was selling tea to passersby. I was just stopping in for tea. She wasn't an attendee of these workshops, but this was just part of my ethnography. And there were a group of people there, and one woman who was there asked me, what are you doing here? And I told them I was studying human rights. I told them I was studying the rule of law and I was studying human rights. And I remember one of the women just sort of looked away, off into the distance. And it was as if I had mentioned I was studying Mars or something so distant from their daily life experience, something they don't think about. And a Sudanese lawyer I later met told me, and this quote is not on the screen, but a Sudanese lawyer I later met told me, he said, look, if I haven't seen an apple, then I won't know what an apple is. And if I haven't seen rights, then I won't know what rights are. So civic groups in Sudan were teaching people to believe that law, rights, courtrooms can liberate people from oppression. But when I sat with this woman who was selling tea in this tent in this IDP camp, this displaced persons camp, I thought, is all of this an illusion? Is all of this some kind of illusion of hope? Illusion of hope, like traveling to Mars, given the realities, the daily realities of people's lives? I don't have a good answer to that question. I don't have a good answer to that question. But I thought in order to understand that question, let me think about, okay, maybe if the participants themselves can't use rights to change their daily experience, what about what about these folks? Let me go back. What about these folks? The trainers, the facilitators of the workshops. What benefits do they get out of it, out of doing this? Is this an illusion of hope for them too? The activists I met who conduct these workshops, I think they did gain some benefits. And a lot of it was they got funding. They got funding they founded non-governmental organizations. Many of them worked in English, which is the international language of development. They got to network with international lawyers from other countries, from other parts of Africa, from Western Europe, from the United States and Canada. And so these international NGOs in the United Nations became sources of funding for the local civic activists, a lot of them women activists who were conducting these workshops. But something else was going on. Every time I went back to Sudan for fieldwork, the most sophisticated activists I met were actually leaving their local NGOs and they were joining Western embassies, international NGOs, and the United Nations. So they were gaining some benefits. Eventually, as they got to know these people and network with international lawyers, they joined them. And many of them left Sudan and they worked as international staff elsewhere. Employment with these groups provides prestige. It provides much higher salaries. It provides experience working with substantial budgets. They were advancing their careers. But prestige, salaries, budgets, these are not the stated aim of rule of law programs and human rights programs, which is to build faith in the rule of law. And even more important for our purposes today is that the NGOs were promoting a rule of law that was not religious. There was very little space to engage with religious discourse, to engage with Islam. And some of these people were also Christian at the time before the secession of South Sudan. These workshops were also taking place before 2011. And there was very little space to engage either with Christianity or with Islam. And this was, so the workshops were largely, they were largely silent on religious faith. And this was probably most visceral and became most real to me at a workshop I attended more recently in Somaliland. So let me give you kind of this last, in my last maybe 7 minutes or so, let me give you an example of it wasn't a legal awareness workshop. It might as well have been called that, but it was called a restorative justice workshop. Restorative justice workshop. And it was held at the University of Hargeisa in Somaliland, a region that the rest of the world sees as kind of northern Somalia. Actually, on Wednesday, they celebrate 31 years of kind of self-rule from the rest of Somalia. So the workshop that I attended on restorative justice, it was similar to the legal awareness workshops, except the participants were different. The participants in this case were not displaced persons, survivors of civil war living in shacks in the desert. These were sort of high-profile religious and community leaders. These were elders. Many of whom, all of whom, in fact, used Islam or something that they called and thought was Islam as the basis of their dispute resolution. They were all dispute resolution kind of providers in their communities. They were all elders. And the United Nations Development Program and a local NGO sponsored this workshop at the University of Hargeisa. And the UNDP, the UN Development Program, hired a European Muslim, he was a Muslim man, a lawyer, to facilitate this workshop in Hargeisa at the University of Hargeisa. It was a 2-day workshop for this group of religious leaders. And they flew him out to Somaliland to facilitate this workshop. And his goal in this restorative justice workshop was to get these religious leaders on board with the UNDP was constructing a network of offices, buildings throughout the region spaces for a group of people called paralegals. Paralegals are lawyers and non-lawyers who serve as kind of informal mediators of people's disputes. Sometimes the courts aren't trusted, or they're too far away, or they're too expensive, or many other reasons. And so the UN said, why don't we get these paralegals? We'll construct these offices to create, it's essentially the shortening the judicial shadow kind of strategy, but it's the UN's version of it. It's the UN's version of it. And this guy was brought from, this facilitator of the workshop was brought from Europe to try and convince these Somali elders, religious leaders, to buy into the strategy, to take it to their communities and say, oh, hey, the UN is building these buildings, constructing these offices, and we should support it. And so that was his job. That was his job. So sort of towards the end of the second day of the workshop, I went to this consultant and I said, you know, it's really interesting. We were in the break, we were in like a tea break. And I said, it's really interesting. You're speaking to a group of religious leaders, all of whom care and think about Sharia and work with Sharia. And you haven't mentioned the word once in 2 days of this workshop on restorative justice. And I remember he just kind of shrugged his shoulders. He just kind of shrugged his shoulders. And he said that the United Nations, he raised Sharia before he left, when he was doing his concept note and the scope of work with the United Nations Development Program. He said he raised Sharia. He said, I should talk about Sharia or Islam or Islamic law. And he said the United Nations organizers were, quote, mad at me for raising Sharia. And then he added something that was really striking. He said, they're scared of it. They're scared of Sharia. He said, people at the UN did not want me to mention Sharia. He said, but I told them Islam arrived long before I did. I did not make these people Muslims. Sharia is very important to them. But he was told, don't mention it. Don't mention it. Don't go there. So this consultant never talked about Sharia in the 2 days of workshops. He sidelined, he flattened Islam simply by not speaking about it in a workshop with religious leaders who were actively already using Sharia to resolve disputes. So the irony was not lost on him, and I hope it's not lost on all of you. The United Nations hired him as a Muslim lawyer to somehow convince Muslim religious leaders in a Muslim majority society that restorative justice should not involve Islam, but should involve a kind of foreign designed non-Muslim framework at the expense of pre-existing Islamic efforts. And I mention this story because in practice, United Nations projects that I witnessed that promote faith and the rule of law appear strikingly similar to a theology, what I talked about last time, strikingly similar to a theology, where people are being asked to have faith in the rule of law, whether it is in a legal awareness workshop in Sudan, like the one I talked about and I showed you the graduation photos, or whether it is a restorative justice workshop in Somaliland. People are being asked to have faith in the rule of law, to surrender to that faith in the rule of law, and to desire that rule of law. Okay, let me summarize. Today I've discussed how colonial administrators, dictators, and human rights activists are paradoxically quite similar to one another. They have all tried to build faith in state legal systems. They all try to promote faith in the rule of law while also competing with or flattening or sidelining Islam. In next week's lecture, I will show the opposite of this, how people are reclaiming Islam. I will show you how they use Sharia principles to do things like fight colonialism, to do things like topple dictatorships, to do things like fight against warlords in vacuums of state power, to do things like campaign for gender equality. And I'll show you the ways that women's groups, the ways that anti-colonial activists in the 19th century, and everyone in between, and I'll draw from my research in Somalia and Somaliland to show you the ways that they use Sharia as a form of legal politics. But before that, if there's one thing I want you to take away from today's lecture, before we get to next week's lecture, there's one thing I want you to take away from today's talk, it's this. Promoting the rule of law creates a paradox. It can be used to create the very problems that the rule of law is designed to resolve. Because the process of building legal institutions, the process of building faith in the rule of law can flatten religion, and it can also sustain non-democratic authority. So thank you. I look forward to your comments and questions about this faith in the rule of law.